For those of you who weren't here last time, I talked about China and world affairs. And as advertised, I was going to talk about Russia and world affairs today. And then Iran started, the mess started. And then I thought, well, maybe I should switch next time, which is US to now, and switch back and forth. And I finally settled on talking about both Russia and Iran today in world affairs. And then next time I will do the US. And I just want to call your attention to the fact that next time, the next two times are 3 weeks apart rather than 4 weeks apart. And that's so you can all rush to Shakespeare, which starts the following week. And Michael Warren also likes Tuesday, 10 to 12. So, again, the disclaimer, just like I am not a student of China per se, or Russia or Iran, and therefore people who spend their lifetimes studying, let's say, Iran might be appalled at my lack of knowledge. But I do maintain that those of us who look at world affairs have, in a sense, a right to talk about these countries as international actors, even if we're not equipped to deal with the details of those countries' histories, etc. And the histories of both Russia and Iran are very complicated. And now and then I'm actually going to look at a note to get a date right, because none of this is in my brain. And the odd thing about it all is that Russia and Iran actually have something in common, which we don't normally think about, I think, which is in both cases very impressive countries with impressive histories that feel maligned, feel underappreciated, are latching out at the world because of how they feel they either have been mistreated or how they have lost power and influence in the world. So it's odd that two such very different countries actually have this sort of emotional, the world has not been fair to us. And I emphasize this not so much to emphasize American policy, their international policies, as to emphasize why it is we ask ourselves, when both countries have nasty dictators and horrible regimes, so much of the public seems to be supporting the regimes. Because that's sort of a puzzle. I mean, life in Russia is miserable. The Russian economy is by and large miserable. The economy of Russia, which we think of as this big country, is roughly the size of Spain, right? Russia has a population of 146 or 7 or whatever million people. Spain, I think 42 or something around there. So Spain is a relatively small country compared to Russia. Why is the size of this gross national product, its economy, how economists measure it, about the same size? And you've got to know that even though the corrupt elite in Moscow and so forth is living well, many of the Russians are living very poorly. And insofar as they're able to travel or see something about the world, they know that life isn't very good. And but nevertheless, they support Putin, mostly. Not always, but mostly. Why is that? Because he's a nationalist. He's trying to stand up for Russia, for Russia's role in the world. And the same thing is true, really, of Iran, called Persia, right? An ancient civilization, going all the way back to the Greeks through centuries. A country that accomplished much in terms of everything imaginable that we consider a civilization. Literature, in case of Iran, it's poetry by and large, as I understand it, but art and music and all kinds of things. Ditto with Russia. I mean, we all think of Russia in part not on a daily basis in terms of its politics, but we think of it in terms of the famous authors, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Chekhov, all those people. We think of Russia in terms of musicians, famous musicians, even into the 20th century. So we, in the outside world, look at the accomplishments of Iran and Russia as being very much important to civilization as we know it, right? Well, the people living inside those countries also think of it that way. And then what do you find? You find yourself in a miserable situation at home, politically, economically, and you find yourself insulted right and left by the United States, by other countries of one kind or another. And I think superficially, it's always a puzzle to think, so here is miserable Putin doing horrible things, running a corrupt administration, keeping himself in power. You probably read somewhere that he's redesigning the Constitution so he can stay in power forever if he wants to, past 2024, etc. All this manipulation, all this, yes, there is a democratic opposition in Russia, but it's not very strong, right? So why do these average Russians support him? Well, one way, of course, I'm about to give you a very bad analogy, is why are so many of fellow citizens supporting Trump, right? It's not just everybody being stupid, it's everybody, in a sense, having grievances, and there seems to be a person addressing the grievances. And one of the ways to think about Russia and Iran together is to say that in both cases, the population believe that their countries have been internationally aggrieved, if not forever, but certainly in recent years. And that's, I think, more or less what they have in common. What else they have in common, of course, is that so far as they have resources, they put their resources into military activity and outreach, right? What they really want to accomplish is, in spite of the United States and other countries diminishing, or at least talking as if they're diminishing their role in the world, they want to demonstrate that they do have a role in the world and they know how to access the world, right? And in the case of Russia, you have a situation where the outreach is to go back to the Russian Empire, the Soviet Empire, and to say what we want to do is to reclaim power and authority in those states, be it Ukraine, be it Eastern Europe, various countries. We want to reassert ourselves in the bits and pieces of the countries that we've lost, right, that became independent at the end of the Cold War. And how do we go about doing this? Well, you don't go about doing this in 19th century ways. You could use modern technology, the internet, misinformation, control of information, and various kinds of devious techniques by hiring mercenaries right and left to do your bidding, to have some kind of influence. What we preoccupy ourselves with What we preoccupy ourselves with yeah, that would be good, some water. Thank you. In the U.S., of course, is the Ukrainian situation, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the Russians are pretty much all over the world. They are funding mercenary groups, various kinds of opposition groups all over Western and Sub-Saharan Africa. Russia is very busy right now in Latin America in various countries. We don't read much about that because we don't read much about Latin America. In some cases jointly with the Cubans and Cuban outreach, but also without them. They know that there are opposition groups, terrorist groups, and so forth in places like Colombia and Bolivia and all of those countries. And wouldn't you know it, in the last 2 or 3 years, the Russians have funded these groups and have begun to help train the groups along with the Cubans. So the Russians are pretty much everywhere, believe it or not, in spite of their economic difficulties. And the everywhere Latin America, it's Africa, and it certainly is in the Middle East. One of the things you might have read about recently is that the mess in Libya, which we partially participated in causing, is there's a civil war between two leaders. People have divided who they support. Well, the Russians are right there supporting one of the leaders. The Turks are on the other side, and so forth. So wherever there's trouble, and the Russians can wedge themselves into the trouble, even if it's fairly inexpensive, you hire a few mercenaries, you train a few people, they're right there. And to Russians, it feels like we're resuming some kind of global role. Especially useful to resume a global role in parts of the world where you might not even have been very active in the last 10 years, when the U.S. seems to be flailing about. And having difficulties in various parts of the world. And of course, from the perspective of Iran and Russia, they're not particularly ignorant about the mess of U.S. foreign policy, the fact that we don't really have coherent foreign policies. The experts in the U.S. on those parts of the world, whether it's Russia or Iran, National Security Council, they resign after every few months. There's no there. Trump is making his own decisions. You better believe that the Iranians and the Russians know about this and keep up in great detail. So this is a particularly good time for the Russians to reinsert themselves in the world, in various parts, not because they hope to reestablish, the Soviet Union or an empire, but because there is this sense of we are an important historical country, we want to play an important role, even if our economy is pretty awful, right? Now, in both cases, in the case of of Russia, former Soviet Union, there is, of course, the allocation of resources into nuclear capacity, right? And into the latest technology. So the Russians, in fact, are quite well prepared to deal with the technological warfare that's going on, whether it's nuclear technological warfare or whether it's media technological warfare. But of course, so are the Iranians. Because from the American perspective, Iran often looks like, or contemporary Iran often looks like, gee, it's this third world country out there in the Middle East. Well, they may be a third world country out there in the Middle East, but they happen to have a very huge layer of incredibly well-educated people and very good scientists, which is why they can develop nuclear capacity. This is why they can develop all kinds of missile systems. This is why their technological and knowledge capacity is very great. Now, the government may be idiotic, and they might accidentally shoot down or not so accidentally shoot down an airplane, but that does not mean that the Iranians are Nigeria or Mali or some kind of backwater country. No, they're on top of it with an educated population and, of course, with a very young population. Right? 50% of the Iranians are under 35, right? As compared to Russia, West Europe, and so forth, where the population is aging, right? So they have an active, well-educated population in that country. And that gives all the more reason for them to say, we want to play a role in the world. Now, obviously, the Russians want to play a global role in the world, or recoup their global role in the world. And the Iranians are, by and large, happy to play a Middle East role in the world. But don't forget that Iran, or ex-Persia, is the second largest in area country in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia being the other one. So it's a big country. It's not some pokey little country. And don't forget that the religion, well, let me backtrack. One of the things, of course, that Iran presents for international affairs, which the Russians don't present, is this religious aspect to their activities. Now, of course, communism was sort of a religion, but never mind that. Let's deal with traditional religion. Interestingly enough, Persia once upon a time was actually a Sunni country, I think until the 1500s or whatever. I'm not accurate on these things. But then eventually became a Shiite country. But it's the only country in the world where the national religion is Shia Islam. Other countries have Shias in them, high, low, whatever percentage. But it's the only Shia country where the national religion is Shia Islam. Okay, and so from our perspective, when we look at it, it looks like, well, these Shia are crazy people, right? It's the crazy aspect of Sunnis. Well, not so fast. Bin Laden was a Sunni. Much of the terrorist organizations in the world are Sunnis. They're not necessarily Shia. The reason we think of Shiite Islam as being so central to politics is because, of course, the influence of Iran in the Middle East is connecting with the Shiite population in those countries. That doesn't mean those countries are necessarily mainly Shiite countries, right? So the history of Sunni Shiite conflict, the religion conflict, on the one hand can be seen as, let's say, Protestant Catholic conflicts in Western history, right? Different religion. And I'm not claiming that the schisms of those two religions don't have political influence. What I am claiming is that in many ways, those influences of the religion have been politicized and often present political views and not just religious views. Right? So you could be a 37-year-old Iranian who is a Shiite, obviously, but not a terribly religious person, who might nevertheless be supporting the Ayatollah in certain ways because he or she sees it as a matter of national pride and national status. So it's a lot more complicated, I guess I'm saying, than when we normally look at it and we think, oh, well, these are just two religious sects feuding with each other. One has to look underneath it and see to what extent religion is used as a vehicle for outreach in international affairs. And I guess I'm prepared to argue, just for the sake of argument, that part of Iran's role in the Middle East is not so much that they just, or all of them, want to spread Shia Islam, but rather that they want to have a controlling role in many of these countries, right? And the more you mess up those countries, the more likely you're able to have an influence and control over the government and so. So I guess what I'm presenting here is something of a mess. A mess in the sense that we look at Putin for sure as this nasty dictator, and he is a nasty dictator, as do many Russians, as do other countries in the world. But I think the relevant question to ask is, why is he getting away with it? And he's not just getting away with it because he's, threatening to blow the country up with nuclear weapons. He's getting away with it because, just like Trump is getting away with it, a large proportion of the population say, well, at least he gives a status and standing in the world. At least we're relevant actors here in the world. Let me back off a little bit on Russia and say the desire for influence or recapturing influence on the part of Putin can also be seen in the whole Ukraine mess. I've listened to a lot of Russian scholars, and they say, well, of course, Ukraine has always been part of Russia, and they just want to reclaim Russia. And I come along, and I think, Russia the Ukraine was Russian from 1783 to 1954. Okay, so it was part of Russia. But in the 1950s, like in 1954, Russia handed the Crimea back to Ukraine before the breakup of the Soviet Union. So at some point, and people seem not to know, I've tried to find it somewhere in the literature of Russian scholars, people seem not to know why Khrushchev thought it was a good idea to hand Crimea back to the Ukraine. Of course, the Ukraine in those days was one of the republics of the Soviet Union, so it wasn't handing it very far off. But it's still a kind of perversion of history to say, well, Ukraine was always Russian. So, let's look at Ukraine for a minute. In the 1950s, 75% of Crimea was ethnic Russian. Okay, fine. Nowadays, the split happens to be Ukraine per se versus the eastern part of Ukraine versus Crimea. In both cases, in the eastern part of Russia, of Ukraine and in Crimea, the overwhelming population is Russian rather than Ukrainian in terms of what ethnic origin, language, and so forth. And yet, that population, let me see if I can that population in 1991, 91% in the Ukraine of the Ukrainians voted for independence, and 54% of Crimeans voted for independence as part of being Ukraine. Okay, and in eastern Ukraine, Donbass, which we read about all the time, which is all Russians, always been Russians, they're all Russians to live with. In 1991, 80% of them said that they wanted to be part of independent Ukraine. Yeah? Isn't that interesting? So this idea that all of these people are Russians and always want to be part of Russia isn't true to begin with. They may be of Russian origin, but at various times they threw their lot in with Ukraine. So then, of course, the question arises, why did the Russia under Putin decide to do something about Crimea, grabbing it back, right? And saying, actually, this is an integral part of Russia, which is more or less how we read about it in the newspapers. Well, because at the end of the Soviet Union, Russia had to put up with what? The Baltics going away, Ukraine going away, all kinds of places going away, and it shrank into Russia having lost all these countries who are now independent, right? And interestingly enough, Russia kind of prepared for that because just like the Chinese started sending Han Chinese up there in Uyghur country to undermine the uniformity of the Uyghur population and saying, you know, really, we the Han Chinese have a role up there. So the Russians during the Soviet Union started transferring Russians from Russia into Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, all those countries, as well as the Ukraine, right? And made those people loyal to Russia. Now, Putin comes along, right? And when Putin comes along, he says to himself, actually, as part of making a bigger stance in the world, being a more important country, we've got to reclaim some of those places, right? And one of the places to reclaim, of course, was Crimea, a warm water port. Russia's always needed warm water ports, but also to put in place a head of state of Ukraine that was loyal to the Soviet Union, right? He's the guy that then got ousted, that now has a government that is not loyal to the Soviet Union. So, without boring you with the complexities of each of these little bits and pieces, what you see is somehow the same kind of tendency of Putin's Russia first saying, we need to reclaim in terms of, if not their independence or their dependence on us, at least our influence in what was the larger Soviet Union. And you may also remember that one of the things that Putin did was march into Georgia and also try to control Georgia. So if you think of Russia as an empire, which lost most of its empire, one of the things that Putin wanted to do and still wants to do is to reclaim the empire. So Putin's policies internationally can, I think, be divided into two bits. One, reclaiming what you once thought belonged to you, the Soviet Union, and the other to say, never mind US, we're going to play a major world role everywhere in the world in reclaiming our standing and status internationally. And so you have a bifurcation of, on the one hand, those countries that used to be annexed to you versus the rest of the world. And in fact, they're behaving quite differently in those different parts, because what they try to do is annex the folks that are Russian origin in the Baltics and in Ukraine and so forth. While you're obviously not going to do that in Bolivia, what you do in Bolivia, you support some guerrilla group which you hope can destabilize the government. Does any of this make sense? Because it's sort of mind-bogglingly complex in some ways. Now, what is surprising is that a very weak economic Russia and an increasingly economic weak Iran, which we of course do everything in our power to make Iran weaker, right, with all the sanctions and so forth, are still able to play as big a role as they are. And that, of course, in the case of Russia, has to do with Russian populations in various places. And in the case of Iran, it has to do with links to the religious Shiite groups of people in various countries. So they're playing this game very differently, but in both cases trying to get support on the part of small populations, which can either destabilize or annex them one way or the other. Now, in the case of the rest of the world, outside of the Middle East and Europe, the Russian role is not the same as the Chinese role, which I discussed last time, because in the case of the Chinese, they're less interested in the politics of those countries in the first instance, and what they're doing is heavy economic investments, which gives them a foot in the door of all those countries, right? And as the U.S. in particular pulls down from foreign aid and so forth, the Chinese are not just building the bend in the road, the old Silk Road, but they're also investing heavily in every kind of major industries, mining, extractive industries, other industries, infrastructure projects, and so forth, all over Latin America and all over, at least in parts of Africa. So that's what they're doing. The Iranians don't have the money or the population to do that, right? Much smaller country. So they are not spreading out globally. They're confining to themselves to the places where they have an in, namely Shiite populations in various places. So I'm not claiming they're both alike. All I'm saying is there are similar motivations as to why the populations are supporting them. I keep repeating that. I think that's really, really important. Now, in terms of recent activities, Ukraine, of course, has been in the spotlight for Russia, in part because of Crimea and so forth, and in part because they are very concerned that the European Union is playing a bigger influence in the former Eastern Europe, right? So that dynamic is particular to Russia. If it had not been for the fact that immediately after Ukraine devolved itself from the Soviet Empire, NATO and the European Union got very busy, as did the Ukrainians, who were wanting to get out from under Russia, was very busy trying to say, you're now part of us. And that was a red flag for Russia. Right? It's one thing to say this is a former part of our empire, but now they're independent. But no, the EU and NATO is drawing the Baltics and Ukraine and so forth into its orbit. And that freaked out the Russian establishment, right? Because that really means not just that we've lost our empire, but we now have the enemy, so to speak, Europe, the United States, moving in on us, right? From Europe now, well, England is leaving, but, from the 28, they expanded from 6 to 18 to now 28, and a lot of that is East Europe, and moving in. And NATO in particular means for Russia that the military umbrella, theoretically, will now cover countries which used to be in the military orbit of Russia, right? This is serious business for the Russians. And if you are, Mr., Mrs., whoever, sitting in a village in Russia, as horrible as your life may be, you say, wait a second, what's happening there? Of course I have to support Putin because he's standing up for our country against Western influence that we've grown up all our lives. We've heard about, the horrors of the U.S. and the West and all the terrible things they're doing to us. And now they're moving in on us, on our former colonies, but obviously not real colonies. So, in the case of Russia, there's a two-pronged, I just tried to explain, a two-pronged activity. One is to hold your own in Europe in some fashion, and the other is to spread your wings internationally and globally and become a relevant power, right? As we speak, you can't really decide anything permanently or peacefully in Syria, or for that matter, Libya, maybe even Iran, without Russia having to play a role, right? Russia is now the mediator. Hey, we finally achieved something. People are going to have us not as an enemy or a neutral country, but we are now a mediator in disputes. And as the U.S. fades, we'll talk about that next time, as the U.S. fades, there are vacuums to be filled. And one of the vacuums that Russia can fill is saying, well, the Americans have just moved out of supporting the Kurds in Syria. Boy, we can move in and help the situation and negotiate and so forth. So the Russians are also not stupid. They are finding opportunities. And among other things, the U.S. is giving them opportunities, which is a separate issue for next time. Now, let me just go back to the size of populations here. The Russian population is roughly speaking 146 million. The Ukrainian population is roughly speaking 42 million. The Iranian population is roughly speaking 82 million. And the Spanish population is roughly speaking 46 million. I don't like throwing this stuff out at you, but I want to make a point here. That is to say, Ukraine and Spain are roughly speaking have the same size of population. Okay? And Russian population is huge compared to all the rest. But on the other hand, Iran is a big country by dint of population, right? It's not some small Middle East country. It is a big country with lots of people living. And so the Iranians are also aware of the fact that we're not some pipsqueak post-colonial country in the Middle East. We have an honorable and long history out here, number one. And number two, we're a major country. We should play a major part. And number three, the big boy on the block nowadays, because of natural resources and other things that opposes us, seems to be Saudi Arabia, right? And Saudi Arabia has a tiny little population, but lots of natural resources. And Saudi Arabia is sort of the the headquarters for Sunnis, as they imagine themselves to be, right? Because it's a Sunni country. So there you have a resurrection of the Shiite-Sunni split. That is to say, the Iranians are not just out for being taken seriously, but being taken seriously in the warfare between Sunni and Shiite in the Middle East and the division of countries in respect of what they are. Now again, most of the Middle East experts and so forth will argue that it's a religious sectarian thing, and I guess I want to argue, yes, there are religious sectarian differences, but in some senses they're a cover for political differences as well, and political goals. It's used as a vehicle for something else. You can quarrel with me on that, and as I said, lots of people disagree about that. But anyway, so let me just run down some. I again apologize. I promise next time not to talk about statistics and things. But let me just run down how the top layers of the countries in the world's economy. So the U.S. economy is the strongest. We all know that. The Chinese come next. After that comes the Japanese. After that comes Germany. After that comes India. After that comes the UK, sort of France, whatever. By the time you get down to 11th country in terms of its economy, you get around to Russia. And when you get down to about 12, you get down to Spain, which is, as I mentioned before, the Spanish economy and the Russian economy are about the same size. They have a few places apart. Then you look at the population, and this is just some stray information. The World Bank and other people put out the demographics of people's longevity. So you have countries now in the world where the population life expectancy population is sort of 84, 83. And what kind of countries are those? Those are Hong Kong on top, Japan, Switzerland, Singapore, Australia, Ireland, South Korea, whatever. And when you get down to about the 49th country in the world, you get down to the U.S., where life expectancy is 78, right? And where we have our life expectancy is going backwards rather than forwards. Okay, so that's what gets you to the U.S. When you get to China, China is only like 77 years life expectancy, so that's only like 1 year difference from the U.S. And you get down to Iran, and it's 69, right? So that's quite different. When you get to the bottom, they're mostly, when you get down to 100 and something out of 200 countries, 149 I think, you get to Russia, where the life expectancy is like 72 years. That's men and women, but when you get to Russian men, life expectancy is only 67, and their life expectancy, along with that of America, is going down rather than up. And then when you get to the very bottom, where folks only live to 50-something, you get to mostly poor African countries. So I don't want to bore you with all the statistics. So we pride ourselves on being this, country that treats, we eat well, we have good medical care, and so forth. But a whole bunch of countries are in much better shape than we are. Why is this relevant? Well, it's relevant because if you are a country which has an aging population, this becomes relevant. And therefore, this is very relevant for the aging population of Russia, which is not only in bad shape in terms of life expectancy, but is aging. And that is not a good thing. And the Russian government has to take that into account these days. And you get to a country like Iran, whose life expectancy isn't very great because they're very poor, but on the other hand, they have such a young population, and if their economy were less badgered by the U.S. and other countries, their life expectancy might go up very quickly, right? Because they're not as yet all overweight and suffering from diabetes, right? Which is what the problem is in the US, among other things. And they're not all on opioids and those kinds of things. So what I'm saying is, if you're Iranian, you say to yourself, we have a future. We may not look very good right now, but we have a future. And if you're Russia, you're saying to yourself, we better spread out over the world because our domestic situation is really quite bad and we need to take it into account. Does that make some kind of sense? So, where are we? Where we are is obviously a declining role of the U.S., which I'll talk about next time, and an increasing role in the declining role for NATO, and conceivably a declining role for the European Union after Brexit. We'll see. I'll talk about Brexit again in the last session. And a situation that has given an opening to Putin and Russia everywhere. Now, they're not so much smarter than everybody else in the world. They often blow it, right? So I'm not saying their policies are always successful. Very often they're not successful in what they're trying to do, right? And it's an interesting question for somebody who studies Latin America, which I don't per se, is that, are the Chinese going to be in the long run more successful in some Latin American countries than the Russians? I'm willing to bet on the Chinese, but it's perfectly possible that some of the corrupt Latin American countries are sufficiently politically shaky that the Russians can turn the governments around in one fashion or another. So they have very different purposes. That is to say, what China is looking for is markets, right, and natural resources, and what Russia is looking for is power and influence of a political kind. So it's important to bear that in mind because it's very different. It has very different implications in terms of policy and how others should direct themselves against it. Now, let me spend the next few minutes talking about the mess in Iran. I hope I'm not repeating too much that you've heard either Fareed or Rachel talk about. So I keep saying I'm the poor man's Fareed Zakarian or Rachel Meadows, poor woman's Rachel Meadows. The killing of the second most important political figure in Iran is not like killing bin Laden. It's one thing to kill guerrilla leaders in various parts of the world, which, by the way, I don't actually approve of either for a variety of reasons we can discuss, but in any event, to essentially kill or assassinate somebody who is a high official in somebody else's government. In fact, that's against international law by any standards. Right? Now, the argument, of course, that the U.S. has made is that they were about to attack us. It doesn't look like that was the case, but even let's imagine it was the case. You still don't assassinate important figures in other governments for that. You can do all kinds of things, but you don't do that. So the Iranians' outrage about what happened got almost uniform Iranian support, not surprising, because it was such even for anti-government Iranians, such an outrage that this happened, even though they hated him. Now, the problem for us as Americans is we know these people are all bad guys. I mean, he was a bad guy. He did, in fact, kill lots of people and led to lots of mayhem. But on the other hand, most countries post-World War II said to themselves, let's have some rules here. Because if we have some laws and rules, it helps us as well in the long run. It's, your kids are playing with a bully and the kid hits the bully and it feels good. And then you say, don't do that because then the bully or the bully's friend will hit you back and it'll escalate. And this is not a good thing. There's a better way to deal with this, right? So, we killed him. Outrage in Iran. Lots of support for Iran throughout the Middle East, even in countries that normally are hostile to Iran. including Sunni dominant countries. Okay? This was not a winning activity on the part of the US. Then of course the airplane gets shot down. Well, let's assume, best case scenario, that it was accidental, right? That the missiles just went out of control. What it showed was Iranian incompetence, because what they should have, of course, done is make sure that commercial planes don't fly anywhere near where missiles might be shot. So this is a black mark against Iranian competence. And of course, many observers in the US said, see, they're really incompetent. They don't know what the hell they're doing. We can discuss that. But that, of course, meant that the Iranians, disposed to being anti-regime, now have some leverage again, because they then demonstrated against that. That tells you something about the complexity of Iranian politics, because it tells you, on the one hand, that people hate the regime, and on the other hand, have a sense of national pride and want to think of themselves as a competent international actor, a competent domestic actor. So this did not go down well. But what's even more important, I think, is that in Iraq, which we of course helped create a total mess in as a country, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in other countries, you have had in the last year opposition to the Iranian influence in their countries. Right? That was one of the good signs. That is to say that the Iraqis, even Shiite Iraqis, who you would have assumed would be supporting anything the Shiite Iranians did in their country, were demonstrating against external interference. Ditto in Lebanon. The Lebanese are in an outrage about their government, but they're also in an outrage about external interference, okay, by the Iranians, Hezbollah, and all of that. So that was the first time in years that you saw a crack in terms of the Iranian strategy in the Middle East, their international strategy, which actually, when you think about it and back off, tells you something we've discussed numerous times. At the end of the day, people do like their sovereignty. They have some pride in their country. And as messy as Iraq might be, and as messy as Lebanon might be, at the end of the day, you say, we're a big mess, we've got to sort it out, but what we don't need is other people manipulating it. A general from Iran, financial support to Hezbollah, and so forth. And that actually is a fairly good sign, which is that even not terribly well-informed populations are kind of outraged by having people interfere in their internal affairs. So from the perspective of Iraqis now, on the one hand, they oppose the Iranian interference for the first time. They're sick and tired of Americans there, of one kind or another, and military and so forth. And essentially they're saying, our country is a mess, but would you please leave us and try to sort out this mess? And the same thing is happening in Lebanon, and the same thing is happening in other bits and pieces of the Middle East. Enter Russia. Well, you might not like those folks, but we can help you out. Right? This is not going to go well either. So, nationalism of one kind or another, even in the presence of ethnic conflict, of religious conflict, often at the end of the day is what people identify with. Iranians are proud Iranians. Iraqis are proud Iraqis. They may have their differences. The Sunnis might not like the Shia and vice versa. But at the end of the day, they say, we're Iraqis, right? And we don't want external interference. So one of the things that the killing of Soleimani achieved was that it kind of had to shut people up in terms of getting rid of the Iranians, right? Because now you had to defend the Iranians because they were maligned by American behavior. So that set the whole dynamic of the Middle East, which was a rise in nationalism, overcoming religious divides to some extent, trying to figure out a better way to govern. These were just baby steps. I'm not saying it happened, just small baby steps. But these were undermined by the killing of the Iranian official. Now, where this is going to go in the next few months, I can't tell you which stream of these is going to prevail. But it's interesting to see that you don't just kill some guy, some general that you dislike and who is a terrible person who has killed all kinds of people, and not worry about the repercussions. And of course, one of the things about the U.S. policy is we have no clue right now as to what repercussions are of anything we're doing. But that's next time, right? So, what do we make of all of this? What we make of all of this is that what we reaped in the Middle East is a total mess. What we reaped in the Middle East is more hostility to the U.S., but we also reaped were the beginnings of baby steps and vestiges of people wanting to rid themselves of Iranian influence. Right? What we also reaped is the fact that we put these sanctions onto Iran now, which makes the misery in Iran even worse. And it's made it very difficult for the Europeans, the Russians, and the Chinese, which were all part of the nuclear deal which Trump nixed, to help out in any way. And so, on the one hand, we take pride in our power, and one of the big powers, of course, we have is that everything in the world, more or less, is denominated in the US dollar, right? And the Europeans were trying to rescue Iran by figuring out a way to not have to deal with the European dollar. And that was complicated, and I won't bore you with that right now, but that didn't work out very well. So now you have a situation where the US has very little influence over Europe. Europe has declining influence over Iran. The Russians are not in a position to really reap the benefits here because they're not involved enough in internal Iranian politics. And for a variety of reasons, the Iranians are not in love with the Russians either. So you have a weakened Russia in the Middle East. You have a weakened Iran in the Middle East. You have a weakened America in the Middle East, one kind or another. And the kind of relative orderliness of all these events, pre-Putin, pre the Ayatollah, and so forth, has been undermined by undermining the very alliances and the very institutions that drew both Russia and Iran into international networks and behavior. As you know, the Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna certified that Iran was not violating the treaty. It's just that the U.S. wanted a better treaty for more years and so forth. But at the end of the day now, you have a mess with that treaty. And of course, the Iranians are now saying, well, now we're going to go more nuclear. By the way, that does not mean that they're about to have, nuclear weapons. What it does mean is that they're enriching the uranium so that the breakout time between having them and not having them and having them has narrowed again, which it's complicated technically. We can discuss it. So, what have the Russians achieved so far? Not much. What have the Americans achieved so far? Not much. What has happened in Russia? Putin is trying to hang on to dear life politically to restructure Russia so he can stay in control. Whether that's really possible, if the economic reverses continue in some cases, in the case of Russia, is hard to say. What has happened in Iran? Well, the Iranian government is very, very shaky. Will there be another revolution in Iran? I can't tell you. But what I can tell you with absolute certitude is that Iranians are a very proud people with an ancient civilization, a history behind them, and they know that they're different and distinctive from other Middle East countries. They have historically played a major role in the Middle East, and they intend to continue to do so. And if that's the case, we meaning Americans, better think of Iran not as these, crazies, but rather try to understand where they're coming from and addressing their rage, their power, their creepiness, their way of dealing with things. And after all, supporting terrorism, or terrorism per se, is a sign of weakness rather than strength. Right? We in the media often portrays it as, this country is strong because it has these terrorists. Terrorists can create a nightmare out of countries, as we know in Syria and many other places. But terrorism is the military resort of countries which are militarily and politically and economically weak. What's the fix there is to not make them weaker, but rather to strengthen them in some ways. Anyway, I strewn out tons of stuff. Have a break, and then we can discuss. 2 points came up in the break that I just want to briefly address. One is that, the Ukraine itself is a major gas and oil producer, number one. And number two, one of the things that Russia is able to do, and increasingly Iran as well, is of course use modern technology to get through to people. And we know all too well how that is operating. So we're not talking 19th century, we're not even talking 20th century, we're talking 21st century, where countries have access, A, to cut media access. For example, Iran cut media access for a few days. And B, to use media to do its politics. And we don't really know how this is all going to end down the road, because it's a kind of a new world. It's a new world in part, not just because of the internet and smartphones and all the rest, but also because almost everybody in all these countries has access. 10 years ago, everybody in Iran and in Iraq and whatever didn't have access to the media, and therefore couldn't be lobbied or misinformed or organized by their own government or whatever. But increasingly everybody has access. And it's very hard to know how that's going to impact on international politics. It obviously impacts domestic politics, but since we're dealing with international politics. Okay, guys, questions? Yes, sir. Next time. No. But let me say a few words in terms of the Ukraine. Ukraine, like Russia, is totally corrupt in terms of its economics. Of course, we're quite corrupt too, but never mind. So, on the one hand, you have corruption. On the other hand, in the Ukraine, you also have the residual Russians still present, which are linked, or so pro-Soviet, let's say, and Russian Ukrainians who are linked into Russia, right? So that influence of Putin, on the one hand, directly into the U.S., on the other hand, indirectly through the Ukraine. So Ukraine is still a conduit for Russian activity. These hoodied hypes that have been on Rachel recently, and Trump and whatever, are linked in various corrupt ways to the Ukraine. Now, of course, on the other side, there is, Biden and Biden's son. I'm willing to believe that Biden didn't do anything wrong. What he did wrong, actually, is to not stop his son from getting involved there. That was a very bad judgment call. I mean, it's one thing to say, I was grieving, my son was dying, I'm a victim of tragedy, which indeed he is. On the other hand, he should have had the political wherewithal saying, do not get involved in the Ukraine. So it's a monumental mess, and it's part of the corruption both within the United States and American individuals linking with Ukraine. But it's not just Ukraine, it's also Russia, right? Because after all, the attempt of Trump to build a major hotel in Russia and so forth was also through all kinds of corrupt conduits, right? So there is a kind of global corruption going on, of which Russia, Ukraine, the United States, and then some others here and there are part of. And so you have, on the one hand, sort of, citizens concerned about their life on a day-to-day basis. Then you have a government. Then you have parts of the government being part of international corruption. Then you have international corruption that's not part of the government, that rides above or below the government. And all of this is going on simultaneously. So in order to make any sense of it, one really has to take a particular instance and say exactly, take a blank piece of paper and saying, how did this go from here to there, to there, to there, to here? And it's startling. You get a map, of multiple colored lines going every which way. And because of contemporary communications, this can happen very quickly. I mean, this is not in the days of Benjamin Franklin, where it took 3 weeks to cross the ocean to get the next message across. This is instant stuff. So, 1984, I don't know, you get a world where the technology overrides measured decisions on individual parts and even elected officials. And in societies in particular that are considered unfair by a chunk of the population, there's encouragement of this. Just like a part of the U.S. population is encouraging Trump, right? Because somehow he seems to speak for them. And so are some of the oligarchs in Ukraine are speaking for some alienated Ukrainians, right? Who are very upset with a comedian now heading their government who's trying to get rid of corruption. So I don't mean to, I know I'm not really answering your question, but there is no simple way to explain it except to say that these are networks and they're international networks. And you can see by the Parnas guy and what's his name? Lev Parnas, right, didn't get the syllables right. Lev Parnas, you can, even though he is now, coming clean supposedly on all kinds of things, just look at this man and the life he's led and all the things he's been involved with, right? I mean, we might welcome the fact that he's blowing into the Giuliani and Trump mess and saying what they're saying isn't true, and here are our messages and so forth. So we sort of listen to it and we just think, well, this is not bad. This guy is coming clean. He's a nice guy. But step back for a minute and see what kind of life he's led, right? And there are lots of others like them because they have multiple citizenship. They can travel within, hour, and within seconds they can email and send text messages. I think we have no way of knowing how to control this at this point, or what to do about it, or the magnitude of it, which is huge. I have no answers. Yes, sir. Well, much of that population, as I can tell from people who live in Iran and study Iran, and I can read, I don't have first-hand Iranian experience. Much of that population is much more secular than we imagine, to begin with. They're not all, serious Shiites, whatnot. When we see them on the screen, of course, they all look the same, right? Because they all have to cover their heads and all the rest of it. Underneath, they have hairdos, wear lipstick. They're wearing jeans. At home, they dance. They do all kinds of things. They have parties. So there are Um, there's actually some pretty good literature. It's now some 10 years old by actually a former Santa Cruz student. Mulvaney is the last name. One is called Lipstick Jihad, and the other is called Honeymoon in Tehran. Um, she is of Iranian origin but raised in the U.S., and she's a journalist now living in England who spent a lot of time in Iran and who sort of describes her generation of people. She's now, I guess, in her 40s, maybe early 50s. And she's still, nowadays she can't go to Iran anymore, and I've communicated with her and seen her in England, but she still has relatives there and so forth. So that gives you, if you want, it's an easy read, and it gives you a kind of a flavor of what the younger generation are like in Iran. They're sick and tired of the Ayatollahs, as far as one can tell. They would like to get rid of this government, and they would take, any opportunity to change their society. What they also don't want to do is either rot in jail or get, done in. But so they're careful and they're cautious. But you can see that they are that how quickly they came out after the downing of the airplane, and that age, if you look at the pictures carefully, the age group of each of these demonstrations was quite varied. Much older people in the support of the government against the killing of Soleimani, and a much younger crowd demonstrating. And the younger crowd was increasingly gaining active until all of this happened. So I think the younger generation in all societies, that's true in Europe and that's true in England, the younger generation are against Brexit and so are much more internationally mobile, often educated abroad. The last thing we should do is stop these folks from coming to the U.S. to study, but of course that's what we're doing right now. And I think that, there's a different future there. Now, having sort of painted a fairly optimistic picture of the younger generation, that's also true, by the way, in Iraq and other countries in the Middle East, one should not underestimate the fact that many of these countries didn't have any democratic experience. And it's one thing to say we want more democracy, it's another to really know what that looks like. So I'm not as sanguine as some people are who are saying, oh, well, just wait until all these old guys are killed or died or something, and the younger generation will blossom into this democratic Iran. Well, not so fast. It's difficult to develop democracy and to keep it going. Even Russia, of course, is a good example, right? They had democracy for a while, then they became a dictatorship again. Right? So, on the one hand, on the other is my answer, I guess. Yes, ma'am. No, I don't think so. What goes going on in our country is more similar than that. Uh, what he, yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Is what's going on with Putin restructuring, is that similar to Germany in the 1930s? And I don't actually think so, which I could be wrong, because what it is unclear how this is going to work out. That is to say, it's unclear that after 24, if he takes over the council, if there aren't younger generation, because the younger generation in Russia in government is also getting restless about Putin, right? So I think it's unclear how this is all going to go down. I don't think that he has he may have something in his mind, but a clear plot. I think what he wants to do is to somewhat diversify the pockets of power. And he's imagining that there'll be a president and a prime minister, it's not him, and that he can, from behind the scene, control things on the council. So in that sense, it's quite different. And whether he is able to pull this off, or has a heart attack tomorrow or whatnot, it's too hard to tell. I mean, we're in 1920, and he's talking about 1924. And actually, I think, sorry, 2024. That's same. I'm sort of semi-crazy. So I think I wouldn't make predictions of how this is all going to come out. I think that one can imagine if he's in good health, if there aren't younger generation people who are in Putin's camp. I'm not even talking about opposition. I'm talking about younger people in Putin's camp who want to crack at some power. Right? So far, he has no opposition within his, group of people. Right? They're all toadying up to him, and he's made sure they don't become famous. And Medvedev, everybody knows, is no good or useless and corrupt, and so he gets bounced around from here and there. But he's not a real threat, right? But but where this is going to go and who the new bureaucrats are, I wouldn't be sanguine about predicting that. Yes, ma'am. No, the whole government didn't resign so much as it's would be equivalent to the cabinet in the U.S. resigning, right? And that didn't happen overnight without them knowing it. That was part of a plot of reorganizing the structure, right? And it doesn't mean that some of the better chaps in that group won't reappear in some different guise. It's not, these people are not ousted and now will go to prison. They're just being sidelined for the moment as the restructuring is taking place. Yes? Well, ask a more specific question about that, can you? Yes, but so the New York Times published a document about, Iran's incredible influence in Iraq. So to begin with, of course, when Saddam Hussein was wiped out, the Sunnis were wiped out, right? Which led to eventually ISIS and all the rest of it, which eventually led to the U.S. saying we've got to keep fighting ISIS, and you have a weak government, which is now essentially a Shiite government. That's not quite true either, because the Kurds are still there. And the Kurds are mighty powerful, and the Kurds know what they're doing. So no government in Iraq, apart from giving autonomy, complete autonomy to the Kurds, which, by the way, they would love, because they're Kurds in all the neighboring countries, right? There were Kurds, and so Kurds would like to have a country of their own. They're actually the largest minority at this point claiming a state that doesn't have a state in the world. So the Iraqi government comes into power, and they are a Shiite government, and they try to sideline the Sunnis and the Kurds, but they sort of bring in at least one Kurd at the higher level. And given the Americans and the war and all the rest there, almost all the Iraqi Shiites who are in government are entangled in serious corruption, right? Serious corruption with the U.S. military, but also with the mercenaries that are paid for by the U.S. and eventually Iranians, right? So you have a very corrupt government in Iraq. And the situation, socioeconomic situation, after the fighting, quote unquote, ended, hasn't improved. In fact, in many ways, people have suffered more. So by the time you get to 2019, I got the century right this time, 2019, you have Iraqis being sick and tired of the incompetence of their government. And who do you look for at the incompetence? Well, the head of state, who is now just temporarily there because he's been ousted, and a parliament that doesn't, well, they do things, but it's not clear who or what they represent, and some of them are also corrupt. So you have the Iraqis say to themselves, how do we rid ourselves of this mess so we can reorganize Iraq? And part of the mess is now Iran, who are the backdoor people at every ministry in terms of the oil reserves, in terms of not rebuilding, what needs to be rebuilt and so on. So increasingly the Iraqis say, let's get rid of our government, but simultaneously we need to get rid of the Iranians, right? And getting rid of the Iranians started picking up steam at the end of 2019 as we moved into December and January. The idea was that this was getting very serious because Shiite clerics, who are usually in a strong alliance with the Iranians, were themselves saying, we need to recapture our sovereignty and do something about this country, right? So the Iranians are in deep trouble in Iraq, as is the United States. Now, whether at the end of the day any government is going to emerge in Iraq, which will push out the Americans and the Iranians, is totally unclear. As you know, the Americans have been told to go home, and there's a lot of public support for that, and of course the U.S. says we're not leaving. And the Iranians are saying, don't blame us for this mess. So people aren't leaving very quickly. But as far as I can tell from reading about it, again, I have not visited Iraq, reading about it is that there's a very strong anti-Iranian opposition now, especially amongst the younger population and in urban areas. At some point, these protracted wars that go on for year after year, at some point, people just get sick of it all. They just want some peace. They don't want to constantly fear that they're going to be blown up if they go on the street. They want their schools to reopen and have supplies. So the socioeconomic aspect of things not improving is what tends to mobilize people in all countries. It's not the highfalutin politics or even religion. People want to have a reasonable life. And going back to the earlier question about technology, the fact is that everybody in the world can now see how other people live. That used to not be the case, right? So you instantly know things are better somewhere else. People are not suffering the way we are suffering. And that politicizes people. And that, of course, is true in Iraq. So what will the outcome of all of this is, I can't tell you. But yes, the Americans are hated, the Iranians are hated, and people want out of those people, and they want a reasonable government, whether they're going to get it and what's going to happen. But you see, part of the problem is that if the Americans leave, and if the Iranians leave, the external resources that are needed to rebuild Iraq also go away. So it's a catch-22 for countries. You kick people out and you say you want to be more autonomous, but then you say we need external resources. And then, U.S., other countries say, well, we've plowed in billions of dollars into Iraq. Yeah, we've plowed in billions of dollars, but they were military dollars. They were not economic, social betterment dollars, right? So you say to somebody in Kansas, we're sick of this Iraq business. Our tax money is going to Iraq. Why isn't it staying here? We need help. And it's very difficult to explain that the tax money has been military tax money rather than helping people. And so there's a shrinking worldwide of foreign assistance that is not tied to political agendas or military agendas. And so it is increasingly difficult for countries to improve the situation of average Mr. and Mrs. whoever, Iraq. Now, it's also the case that if politically those countries become corrupt, for example, Ukraine and other places, then even transferring resources meant to improve things economically wind up in the wrong hands. And so the corruption that rears its head in all those countries, because, take any of us. Let's say we are Iraqis for a moment, and we have 2 children, and our life is miserable. Our homes have been destroyed. We've had difficulties since the children were born. But now the children are ready to maybe go to university. Won't we do a little corruption to get the kids into university because we hope they're going to have a better life? Or are we going to say we're so pure, we're not going to do that sort of thing? You know, we're just not doing that sort of thing. So perfectly good people who are not normally engaged in deep corruption become corrupted through the process of there not being any other channel than the corruption channel. And how you change that, even if external influence leave, is beyond me. Yes? So you're saying the reason the Soviet Union collapsed was because of the decline of its economy, because they were spending so much on the military. Well, it's still spending so much on the military. I mean, they are spreading their military into the North Sea, the ships. There's now a nuclear factory that's a ship. That's the first one ever in the world. They still, on balance, make sure that they have the military resources to defend themselves and make themselves into a big power. So if you were a Russian citizen now, critical of your economic situation, you would still be living in some village with a broken down school and no roads and the electricity not working all the time. You would say to yourself, why are we doing that rather than helping us? Which is why underneath it all, there's large public opposition. But the problem is that there's also national pride. And so Putin plays on that. He plays on the fact we're now moving back into being world actors in a way that was given up at the end of the Soviet period. And I think actually the U.S. and U.S. policy helped that quite a lot. Because if we hadn't crowed victory right and left at the end of the Cold War, we would not have felt as insulting, and the Russian population might have felt that they could be part of a larger, more modern world. But by the time we got through crowing about the fact that we have, victory, the one and only from a bipolar world into a unipolar world. Democracy and our economic system has won, right? That doesn't feel good if you were Russian nationalists, and Russians are nationalists. Now, there we are. That's past history. There's nothing to be done about it. But of course, revisionist Russian historians and political scientists that I sometimes read, argue that even after that, that is to say, after the end of the Cold War, more could have been done to draw Russia into the European nexus of institutions and so forth. The other side argues they were evil power, like Bush declared Iran evil, and therefore they were hopeless. But sometimes, let me back up. One of the assumptions after the Second World War was to deter future wars, you had to network people into alliances so that it would become more expensive to break from the alliances and engage in conflict, right? The whole European Union idea, NATO idea, resuscitating the global institution, the UN, all its agencies, was all an idea that if you and I are interlinked and related, it's less likely that we'll shoot each other because we would both lose, right? And by ending the Cold War in the way it was ended, we made that commitment to the former East European countries that have been absorbed and saying, we're going to draw you into the Western alliances and so forth. That would undermine them having conflicts with each other, having internal ethnic conflicts, although they had some, the Czech Republic broke up and so on. But by and large, they draw them into the European Union, draw them into NATO, give them protection from bigger powers, and so on. So, but that didn't happen with the Russia. And to what extent that was a mistake, maybe 50 years from now people will look at and discuss. But conceivably that was a mistake. Yes. Yeah. Did you all hear the question? No. So by the U.S. pulling out of the Middle East in Syria and so forth, potentially pulling out in Iraq, aren't we making things worse? Aren't the winners Saudi Arabia and potentially Egypt? And haven't we actually created a worse situation? Is that correct terminology than there was before? Yes. Well, the U.S. pulling out of not getting involved in Syria, pulling out of the Kurdish area in Syria, and so forth, has certainly made things worse. It's made things worse for the Kurds, and it gave a big opening to Russia. Before we ever get to Saudi Arabia, it gave a big opening to Russia, because at this particular point, if any kind of peace is going to be ensued or some warfare will stop, whether it's in Idlib province or anywhere else, it's the Russians that have to negotiate it. We're out of the game, right? And so one strong argument, political argument in the U.S. has been, see what happens when the U.S. pulls out. The U.S. stands between chaos and really bad actors, and so forth. Well, yes and no. That is to say, I would say that the U.S. precipitously pulling out of Syria was a serious mistake. I would say that the U.S. pulling out of being kicked out of Iraq is very bad. But that presumes that the U.S. has a central role to play in the future of the Middle East. And the way this is analyzed is by saying, yes, we do. We have to stay in the Middle East because of Israel, right? Israel is our ally. We will protect Israel. It doesn't matter what Israel does. We support it. If you say anything against Israeli politics, you're anti-Semitic. I mean, this is a major political ball of wax in the U.S., right? And that then gives the U.S. the explanation why we have to be there. We're the only reasonable country, peacemaker, the only country that can protect Israel, the only country that can stop the Russians from intervening, and so on. There is a lot of logic to that, but there's also a counter logic. The counter logic is not that you pull out precipitously in the vacuums, but rather that you see that your role has to change and could change from, and make your alliance, let us say, make Iraq actually have felt that the U.S. was a positive influence in the rebuilding of Iraq, rather than a military self-interested. So I think you have to look at that in a more nuanced fashion. Yes, you can criticize U.S. pullouts here and there, especially the way they're done. But you can also see that other countries, for example, European countries, who have in the past and for colonial reasons, post-colonial reasons, and can now play a role, should not have been sidelined and should have been pulled out. Because the idea that it's only us and only we know what's smart and only we can do everything doesn't really make sense. You need alliances. Now, in terms of the religious part of your question, yes, there are, horrible Shiite and Sunni religious nut people who sway a lot of influence. What I was trying to get at is that it's unclear that that is the majority of the population, because those guys terrorize the rest of the population, right? It's not that the random 25-year-old Iranian woman wants to necessarily play the role that the government has assigned to her. She could be liberated from that and might want to be liberated. Would there be a certain percentage of Shiite and Sunni religious individuals who would cleave to their religion? After all, it's not, even strange for us in the U.S. I mean, most Americans have become fairly secular and yet there are, born again Christian individuals who don't think, who are against this, against that, who don't have think women has a freedom to choose. Some now are pro-environmental something, but for a long time weren't, and so forth, pro-gun ownership and all the rest of it. That is to say, every country has religions and they're conservative or radical people within their religion. Right? The question is about the majority of the population. And I'm not so sure that if you were able to, which you're not, to do a reasonable survey of the religious appearance of Shiite and Sunnis in Iraq and other countries, that you would find that everybody are, religious, nutcases, so to speak, who want to, dominate the society, dominate the government. The Russians and the Chinese are actually fairly smart about these sorts of things by saying we don't want to get involved in that. We want to get involved in supplying military hardware to help people, fight against the group and so forth. But we're not going to get involved in these cultural and religious battles. Why? Because they've seen them at home, and they're not dealing with them very much at home, and they don't seem to have an appetite to export that particular thing. I'm exaggerating because in Latin America they tie themselves to indigenous people very often, things like that. So, as we speak, or let's say, go back a month, Saudi Arabia and Lebanon have made alliances with Israel. In fact, Saudi Arabia is quite friendly. Saudi Arabia can be faulted of the mess that they created in Yemen. How is that going to be? And will the Russians and the Americans support them? I guess allows for, rather than ourselves rigidifying our notions. These guys are all bad and they are, doing terrible things. Would I like to be a woman in Iran? Of course not. Or Iraq or anywhere else. But on the other hand, societies evolve. And those societies have been evolving in the last 10 years. They've been put down from the top and through corruption. But I'm not so sure myself what would happen if, in fact, sensible withdrawals were taking place, military support was organized on a multilateral basis rather than on a single basis. I don't have the time to talk about Libya today, but in Libya you can see that the absence of reasonable external support rather than interventions by different people might have made things better than well, if they get too much out of line, you have a Chechnya, right? That was a good case in point. And everybody got the message of Chechnya, right? You don't go too far out of line without serious consequences and your country being destroyed. So it's sort of under the radar to some extent. Putin's government has tried hard to divvy out little perks to different people, and especially the leaders in those autonomous things, which he has tied through corruption into the central dependency, right? So is there anything very explosive happening right now? I don't know. Could something happen? Probably. Is it likely in the next few years? Probably not. There are, of course, religious splits in Russia as well, right? There are the Russian Orthodox Church, but there are also Muslims, right, around. So I don't know how to answer that question, apart from what I just said. Sorry. Yeah. Well, good question. Did you all hear? Well, how does the oil and gas reserves of Saudi Arabia, Iran, Russia, and so forth play into all of this? Well, of course, it plays into it in many and multifaceted ways. The first thing to be said is that the world is getting less dependent on gas and oil, so that all those countries are seeing the future of their resource less valuable potentially, but at the moment that's not the case. Second, that gives them a lot of resources, and those resources can be spent by messing around in other countries and controlling and threatening and telling them, you know, we're going to cut off the gas pipeline if you do the following. The Russians have done that. They're also building a pipeline right now from Russia right into Europe, so Europe needs those resources. But I think, and Saudi Arabia, you know, is sitting on a lot of resources. But the young and not terribly reliable head of the Saudi Arabian government right now sees the writing on the wall more so than older generation, which is why he's trying to diversify the economy. I mean, he sees very clearly that somewhere down the line, oil is not going to be able to speak everywhere. And so the diversification of the economy, and for that matter, the liberalization of the state. I mean, it is remarkable now. You have cafes in Saudi Arabia where men and women can go. Women can now drive. You can do all kinds of things. Now, I'm not saying it's not still a creepy theocracy. What I'm saying is that a younger leader is looking at it and saying to himself, we've got to evolve here. And part of why we've got to evolve has to do with the resource that has been entirely fueling ourselves and our economy. That particular resource is going to have less value and less control. Right? So, on the one hand, oil speaks still today, and I don't want to minimize the importance of oil right now. But what I'm saying is wisdom in those countries is to say we've got to do, you know, clean energy. We've got to do even nuclear energy, and everybody sees the writing on the wall. The degree to which countries see the writing on the wall and the degree to which it forms their current policy, that's an open question, and you have to go one by one. But they're beginning to recognize. The missiles that killed Soleimani would have done more. The missiles of the airplane. Oh, our military bases. Well, if, you know, 150 Americans had been killed, it would have played itself out in the sense that the U.S. would, you know, have responded in one way or the other. I mean, Iran knows that its strength comes from small inroads in various societies, supporting terrorist groups and so forth. They are not big enough and even affluent enough to take on the U.S. in, let's say, a nuclear conflict. Right? They know that. They're not crazy. That's the other thing. We think of them as being crazy. They're not crazy. They actually have a sense of their own limitations. And one of the reasons I say this is because the reason they were willing to enter into the nuclear agreement was because they fear that if they have nuclear weapons, Saudi Arabia would get nuclear weapons, Israel already has nuclear weapons, Egypt will probably get nuclear weapons, and that becomes very dangerous, right? So the Iranians have an interest in having nuclear capacity for leverage purposes without actually developing a nuclear arsenal that can hit somebody, which is why they were willing to enter the agreement and why the Europeans think one could sit down with them even now and make a new agreement, that they're willing to make agreements. So while I'm not exactly answering your question, the thing is, from the Trump perspective, if they had killed a bunch of Americans or flattened the base, they would have said we have to respond, and they would have bopped Iran directly over the head in some fashion. Okay, and what that would have done, God knows, because Iran would not have had the nuclear capacity to respond, right, in the U.S. or somewhere else. Would the Russians have come in at that particular point? I doubt it. They don't want that much of a mess in the Middle East. Would there have been diplomatic negotiations and some ceasefire? Who knows? I mean, I could speculate for the next hour. I have no idea. But obviously, they didn't want to set that off, right? And even though a few Americans got injured, it wasn't at the level of let's have a war here. No one in the Middle East wants a war in which the United States and Russia and nuclear weapons are involved. They know that at the end of the day, it'll kill more people than it'll resolve anything. So I'm saying no one. There might be some hothead somewhere. But basically, people in the Middle East understand. And they also understand that without having to move very much of anything, if the U.S. says to Israel, you're about to be attacked, the Israelis could launch nuclear weapons. They have them. Everybody knows that, right? So in some senses, Israel is both a danger and a security against starting a nuclear conflagration in the Middle East. And Israel, there's Netanyahu who wants to win and this and that and the other thing, but the Israelis also understand that at the end of the day, especially with respect to Lebanon, things could get sorted out. Right? They understand that at some level. And you can't sort of, yes, Israel as a Jewish state, fine. But the majority of people living in Israel, unless you get rid of them this century, will be people who are Arabs. By the way, let me just emphasize that Iranians are not Arabs. Arabs are people who speak Arabic. Iranians speak Farsi, ancient language, Persian, Farsi, whatever. So while even in the press and on television, it all sort of sounds like Iran is part of the Arab world. No, 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 they're distinctive. They are not Arabs, and they don't speak Arabic. And as a matter of fact, they have to often communicate in Iraq and so forth through English and stuff, because they speak Farsi and those guys speak Arabic, right? So it's much more complicated than meets the eye or the way it's often represented in the press, it seems to me, anyway. We've done it. It's noon. See you in 3 weeks.